Well, I was born in a rural village in South Germany called Oberlauringen, about 90 or so miles east of the city of Frankfurt. There were Jews in that community from the 1700s on. There was a continuing Jewish presence in that village. And when I came on the scene, I arrived in 1927. There were probably about 30 or so Jewish people, about 10 families in the community out of about 350 people. Most of the people in the village were farmers, and some were small tradespeople. In a sense, our religion pretty much defined our life in many ways. And yet, if you'd asked my father, "What are you?" he would say, "I'm German. I served in the German army. I'm German." And if pushed along, he would, of course, acknowledge that Judaism was part of his life, but the first reference point would be German. He was a well-respected businessman. He was a kosher butcher in a community that respected him in the early life. From the history I saw, was he was active in the synagogue, and he was but all this changed when the Nazis prohibited the kosher preparation of meat. There was his livelihood. He no longer had any livelihood. I don't know how he subsisted. He sometimes left and came back with bundles of food, how he came to it, but he was a destroyed person. There was a very fundamental transformation of the life of Jews after Hitler came along in 1933, which happened to be my first year in school when I was 6 years old. The transformation was really amazing and shocking and unexpected for all of us Jews, because our relationship to the Christian community seemed to change drastically and unexpectedly. So after Hitler came to power in 1933, one night all our windows were smashed. This was early in the Hitler regime. So at that point, we didn't fathom how come this could have happened, but the atmosphere was changing. So my father went to the local police, because we had no police in the village. He had to go to the next little township. And at that point, the police recommended that he leave the village for a while and stay with his other family. And he did, and eventually came back. So this was the early stage of the Hitler regime where we could still rely on the police being on our side. That changed fundamentally in the late 30s. So in 1936, when I was in second, third grade, Jewish children were no longer allowed to attend public schools, and we had no substitute. So essentially I missed out on a couple of years of elementary school. But during my time in school, I do remember two things: being beaten up to and fro from going to school, and how my classmates sang the Horst Wessel song. The Horst Wessel song says, "When Jewish blood comes spurting from the knife, then things go really well." At that point, I stopped singing for 30 years. For 30 years. Whenever it came time to sing, I said, "I don't know how to sing." So the memories of school were terror. I can only describe my sense of not just school, my life became increasingly beyond fearful, but terror. Now, the terror then wrapped itself around my whole notion of Christians. I didn't differentiate between Nazis and Christians. For me, I was terrified of Christians, all Christians. So my parents never succeeded in leaving, and they were ultimately murdered at the Sobibor extermination camp. So my story is that as things got much worse for the Jewish community, and anybody who could possibly leave did so, anybody who had relatives overseas and so on. Now, we only had a sister of my mother's and her family who lived in Dayton, and they were new refugees in America and didn't have the means to sponsor us, but they managed to sponsor my sister. So my sister was able to leave Germany in 1937, I believe it was. And Ludwig, being older, had left home on a youth movement to try to go to Palestine, of the Hachshara, the movement. Ludwig wanted to go to Israel, and there was a training program in the 1930s to train young Jewish kids to become farmers who would then settle the land in Palestine. And so these were established in several countries, Holland, Italy, I believe, and one of the Scandinavian countries. My brother was sent to Holland. Well, he didn't make it past Holland when the Germans invaded. He was then deported, ironically, to the same extermination camp as my parents were. So anyway, but the rest of us couldn't leave, except my mother found out about the Kindertransport, and she eventually got me onto the transport. And when she was outside the train, she was crying. And I thought, why is she crying? I had no conception that I wasn't going to see her again. There was only one thing in my head, in my mind, I must get away. I must get away. That was the only thing I could think of. My mother, father, nothing was, I couldn't even think about it. In a sense, this was a lifesaver emotionally, in that how else could I have handled that I was saying goodbye to my parents forever? So on the Kindertransport, overnight through Holland to I forgot the name of the place in England where we landed, in Dover.
Dover, yeah.
Dover, I think. And so we landed there, and we were sort of herded first into sort of a holding area in the Margate or Westgate in England, where we stayed for a week or two or so. And eventually some people came and picked themselves up a child. Nobody picked me up. Now it so happened I was a very inward person. There were others who were more outgoing and more friendly, were likely to be picked up. I wasn't. So anyway, eventually, after another stay of a week or so in London at some sort of a school, I ended up at Bunce Court School, which was a, quote, progressive boarding school, which by progressive it meant we studied no classics and no science. We learned how to grow potatoes and practical things and woodworking shop. And we did have classes in English. I didn't do well in school. I had, first of all, I had less elementary education than the other kids. And nobody had ever told me to study. So I didn't. So I did badly. And so I failed the examination that would pass you on to the pre-college. And so I had to leave at age 15. And from then on, for the next 6 years, well, legally I was transferred to London under, quote, the Jewish Board of Guardians, who housed me with a Jewish couple. But that wasn't sort of the end of it for me. That is sort of, for the next 6 years I worked in factories and eventually ended up at Guilford College, who were flexible, let's say, for somebody who didn't have a high school diploma in the admission requirements. They were flexible, also flexible financially. When I told them I had no money, they said, we'll find a way. So somebody told, the other day, my doctor says, you're an overachiever. Well, yes, in a sense, I'm an overachiever. I had no high school diploma. I had worked in factories. I ended up being a college professor at 4 universities in 3 countries and published 10 books. In a college professorship's career, being a full professor with lifetime tenure is it. You're set for life. I twice walked away from such a position without backup. And so the second one was from the first one was in State University of New York, where I was a full professor. I left it up in order to go to Israel. Well, while in Israel, 2 things happened. I never embraced Israel. I never learned about the country. I never wanted to travel. I had no curiosity. And the other thing that happened, I couldn't learn Hebrew. I knew prayer Hebrew to this day, but I couldn't learn spoken Hebrew. We went through the traditional immigration program, 3 months, I think it was, of an ulpan, a residential program. The Israelis have a program of total immersion in Hebrew for immigrants. They have lots of immigrants and lots of demand, and it works. During that time, all your needs are taken care of. You're given housing, you're fed, all your needs are taken care of. All you have to do is come to class and learn Hebrew. During the 3 months I think I was there and attended class, I never spoke. I never opened my mouth. Guess who didn't learn Hebrew? I simply froze and could not. Now to this day I can remember words and so on, but so I had already been appointed a full professor, so obviously I could teach in English as long as I wanted to, but after a while nobody needed to tell me, it's about time you taught in Hebrew. Well, it became an impossible situation for me, and that was one of the reasons why we went back to America. During that stage, I was still in denial about Judaism and being a survivor. I read nothing about the Holocaust at that time, and I claimed in college that as a professor I was saying the Holocaust is not interesting from somebody whose parents were murdered. I said that. Then the next stage in my professional life, I woke up to the realization that there was a whole world of scholarship about the Holocaust and reality facing. But I felt that people in my profession were absent from doing work. It was, and still is, largely. It's not completely true now, but still largely it's in the hands of historians and people who write personal memoirs, and their shtick, their perspective is, we must remember so it won't happen again. You've heard that one. Well, have you ever heard of genocides that happened after people heard about the Holocaust and knew about the Holocaust and still did this sort of thing? So obviously that line doesn't work, but there's something to that. We should remember, owe it to my parents, to our loved ones, we should remember. But don't assume that this is good enough at preventing Holocaust. We must explain not that evil people do evil, but good people, nice people like you and me are fully capable of doing it. And that's what I explore here. So if I had to summarize what am I left with kind of things, is that I received many gifts along the way. I haven't really enumerated them. In England, there was Herta Karger, in whose household, who herself was an immigrant but well-to-do, and had brought out other immigrants, and she took a number of orphan children under her wing and got them going. And so in her household, while I was in London, doing stupid work and in factories, she and the people that was part of her circle of people who she had brought out drummed into me, you must get more education, you must get more education, and you can do something with your life. And the model she had in front of me forever was her own husband in Germany, who way back in the 1920s, 1930s, 1910s, came from a poor family, went to work as a 13-year-old in what we call a department store. And when he was 35, he was head of the largest department store in Germany. But he had the misfortune of dying fairly young, and she then had the option of going to the opera for the rest of her life. She was able to, or doing something with her life. And that kind of outlook was drummed into me over and over again. You can do something with your life. You can do something. So she and there were a number of other persons, but particularly Herta Karger was a major force in making me realize I could do something with my life. Another transformation for me, namely my relationship to Christians. It was Christians who saved my life. The Christian Quakers petitioned the British government to allow Jewish children to come to England, and they succeeded in allowing 10,000 children to be brought to England. So they, in a sense, were behind my being saved. But that didn't end the role of Quakers in my life. I went to a Quaker, quote, progressive school in England and a Quaker undergraduate college. During the past 60 years, my three closest friends were Christians. And one was my college roommate, Vernon Tyson. During the war, when I was in England, after I found out that my parents and the other Jews of the village who had remained had been murdered in the Sobibor extermination camp, I dropped out of Judaism for several years. I wouldn't attend any ceremonies, go to synagogue, attend. I didn't join any congregation. I avoided Jewish people for years. Well, Vernon brought me back. Vernon brought me back to Judaism. He invited me to his church and introduced me that we are very fortunate to have this Jew visiting us today we're honored to have him. What changed my outlook? It maybe was okay to be a Jew. So that was part of the road back. I was thinking of the gifts I got from my parents. From my father, he was a dreamer. His feet were firmly in the clouds. The German word is Luftmensch. And my mother's feet were firmly on the ground, and she saved my life by finding the Kindertransport. My father was a Luftmensch, and for me, this was a different kind of a gift in that it helped sustain me through my ups and downs. So eventually my then former wife and I went with me to Germany 40 years after I'd left. So one of the things that people mentioned to me, well, I'll read that to you before I read the poem. My mother and father and older brother were murdered in the Sobibor extermination camp. The following poem focuses on my mother. She was forever helping people. Whenever someone in our village, Jew or Christian, was in need, she came running to help. During my visit to the village 40 years later, our Christian neighbors reminded me and remembered and told me about her generosity, about my mother's generosity. Yet during the Nazi Hitler time, when our lives were increasingly endangered, none of these neighbors came to our assistance. They were conspicuously quiet. This is what the poem brings to mind. I'm no poet. I have no voice sufficient. Of the saint, my mother, answered to need by one or many, no accounting the price, abandoned by her beneficiaries to the ovens, her presence snuffed, God's eyes in tears. Mine bereft, too dry, left in Guernica.